today we are going to discuss the recent developments in the Middle East and North Africa, what triggered the uprisings in the Middle East, and what will be the consequences of this new shift in the region. So today we have three accomplished, remarkable journalists, writers, and scholars. So let me start introducing my guests. First, on my right, Tony Karen, U.S.-China relations, post-communist Russia, Cuba, and a wide array of stories related to U.S. foreign policy and national security. Previously, Karen was deputy editor of FoxNews.com, the website for the Fox News channel, where he supervised breaking news coverage. Before that, he worked at George Magazine from 1995 to 1996, helping see the project through its first year. On my second left, Joe Luria. Joe Luria is a New York-based independent foreign affairs correspondent, investigative journalist, and written for the Boston Globe, Bloomberg News, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, and the Montreal Gazette, among other publications. He has appeared regularly on BBC World, CNN, and numerous radio programs. At the UN in New York, Joe has been writing about the Middle East, Africa, North Korea, and Iran for 2 decades. He recently spent 6 weeks traveling to 6 countries in the Middle East in the midst of its historic change. Joe is also the author, with former U.S. Senator and American presidential candidate Mike Gravel, of A Political Odyssey, a look at the history of the American defense industry and exaggerated threats it has thrived on. On my first left, we have Professor Lahuna Ganguly. Lahuna Ganguly is a part-time lecturer at the New School in New York at the Media Studies and Film Department. Her doctoral research in international relations examines the significance of private satellite television and global media processes as a socio-political force in India. Lahuna has worked in the television industry in the US and India, and with non-profit groups in designing communicative strategies in support of social justice and development programs. Did all these get started? And what triggered the uprisings? What is the reason of this dominant effect happening in the region?
I think it's quite difficult to pin a single event or a single process on something that's very, very complex and might have had a number of causes. I mean, in Tunisia, we know that the case of the man who became a nationwide thing, one can trace it to a particular event, but, and then similarly in Egypt, the whole Day of Rage idea almost becomes a franchise. Friday prayers becomes a locus of protest. You take the Day of Rage idea, it's replicated elsewhere. It starts to have remarkable effects. It really sort of bears out the old adage, actually, of Leon Trotsky, of all people, once said that all revolutions are impossible until they become inevitable. And that's really what we've seen in the course of this year. But plainly, the reason this all happens isn't simply one incident of repression or brutality, one incident of protest movement, or the habit in a lot of the Western discussion of the issue of sort of attributing it all to our technology, to Facebook and Twitter and so on, that somehow Western society has kind of created the means finally for Arab self-expression, and there's a sort of a desire to kind of take ownership from it. I mean, there was actually, and I'll refer to this a couple of times, there was a great article in today's New York Times which told us that President Obama is planning a reset speech with the Arab world, in which the premise of which is that the killing of Osama bin Laden somehow changes things in the Middle East, that somehow allows the US to adopt what they call a more forward-leaning posture on the Arab revolutions, because there's less danger now that Egypt and Syria will become radical Islamist state. I mean, frankly, it was, to anyone who studies the Middle East, that was ridiculous. It was, the idea that these people are sitting in a bubble, fabricating this idea that Osama bin Laden is actually a relevant factor, or was, in Egypt or Syria is very hard to sustain. But the one thing that sort of struck me in that piece was that one of his White House aides is quoted as saying, when he's looking at Egypt, "I'd really love the Google guy to become president," meaning whale on him. It's that sort of idea of, well, this must be our guy, the Google guy, the technology guy, and so on. That as opposed to looking at what are the politics of these societies, what are the culture, what's the culture, what are the dynamics within those societies which have really asserted themselves. Because I think really what we've seen is a revolution, or a series of rebellions more than a revolution, because I don't think we've actually seen a revolution anywhere in terms of a profound shift to power, and I'll come back to that in a minute. I'll come back to that in a minute. But it's been based on a crisis of legitimacy that's common to a lot of the states of North Africa and the Middle East. That states that are constructed not to serve or even respond to the aspirations and needs of their own citizenry, but are primarily there, have been primarily there serving the needs of a very, very small, self-serving elite and of various foreign power players. And the way that in the West we've looked at those states has been primarily on the basis of that power equation, the geopolitical one, i.e. not, is what's happening in Egypt good for Egyptians? Is what's happening in Egypt good for Israel, and is it good for the United States? It's precisely that mindset that has actually reinforced these regimes. So the idea that they've been there to serve purposes other than those of their own people. And I think that's what's really broken down. It's broken down partly because of a result of a declining global economy. You've had a sort of food price crisis throughout the region that's going to drive, it becomes impossible for whatever model of legitimacy is adopted by a repressive regime. When people are hungry, that gets called into question. And obviously, I think, while poo-pooing the idea that these are kind of Facebook revolutions, I think at the same time it's incontestable that the new media, starting with the creation of the Arab satellite news media, Al Jazeera first and foremost, and then a number of other stations, has created what might be called an Arab public space. Long before the present revolution, there was suddenly a common conversation that was happening across North Africa and the Middle East. As a result of Al Jazeera and other television stations, where there was a common perspective starting to evolve, not even common perspective, but at least a conversation that was far beyond what those regimes were controlling, whether it was about Israel, whether it was about Iraq, whether it was about the place of Islam in society, all sorts of issues. A very lively and provocative public space, which meant that the idea that an experience of events that was happening in one country could no longer be sealed off, and the information flows could not be prevented from spreading to other countries. So I think it's almost unsurprising in the realm of that sort of Al Jazeera-enabled world that events in Syria are felt or in Libya or in Egypt or Tunisia are felt and inspired and are owned in some way by the sort of citizens of that more universal Arab public space that these media have created, and that creates the knock-on effect, the domino effect, as it were. But at the same time, as I was saying, I think we need to be clear that we saw a change of personnel at the top of the regime in Egypt, and it was profound and significant, no question. But I don't think that right now what we've seen in Egypt is the end of the regime. We've seen the end of Mubarak and the Mubarak family. Mm-hmm. But that regime was not created by Mubarak. That regime was created by Nasser, basically, in the 1950s. And obviously it was altered, and it was altered in Sadat's period, and it was altered by Mubarak. But essentially what was proved to us by the events in Egypt is that the regime actually can in some ways survive Mubarak. It's not that I think, unlike Syria, perhaps, the regime in Egypt was not reducible to an individual or a first family, and that what you essentially saw is that in response to there's a reorganization going on, that the military in some ways is still in power. The military is the basis of that regime in the first place. It's still in power and it's reconfiguring itself. It's not necessarily going to hold power, but it's looking for a new political stability. It's looking. It's open. It is definitely incontrovertibly opening up democratic space. There's a lot. The change has been profound in Egypt, and the potential for a democratic, thoroughgoing democratic transformation obviously is there in a way that it's never been before. But it's far from complete. I mean, what you have right now is the military is in power. The military is talking the language of revolution and democracy and so on. It's enabling elections and so on. At the same time, there's repression going on. There's, protesters are still being, on occasion tortured, even, arrested and tortured. So some of the old arms of state security have been taken down, although in some cases the names have been changed, and to some extent the mission. It's really not entirely clear which way things are going to go, although one can see that nonetheless, and certainly from a point of view of foreign policy, which we can come back to, things are going to change significantly. But then, some of those other instances, in Libya, for example, the trajectory of events actually turned out to be profoundly different. Like, once, a protest movement very quickly became an armed rebellion. It may well be the case that the opposition had no choice, that it was simply a case of being butchered in the streets or taking up arms. But also, at the same time, one can see that once it had turned to arms, the character of that revolution changed, and also perhaps the time scale. I mean, I think right now what we're looking at in Libya is very unlikely, is a civil war, and something perhaps that's more along the lines of things that we saw in the Balkans, that it's unlikely we're unlikely to see a rapid collapse of the regime and its replacement by something else, as opposed to some sort of protracted, territorial division and so on. And then, of course, there's also been a counter-revolution, as it were, that's also organized across, transnationally, so that you see, the Gulf monarchs. I mean, I think it was just yesterday or the day before, the Gulf Cooperation Council has now been expanded to include Morocco and Jordan. Well, they've been invited to join; they haven't been taken on board yet. But you're like, okay, this is not the Gulf Cooperation Council. This is actually the Alliance of Sunni Monarchs. But nonetheless, there's a common political agenda in terms of responding to those events. The Bahrain repression, to some extent backing Saleh in Yemen, and very importantly, perhaps in there also is the same independence from the U.S. I mean, maybe this is the overall trend from an international relations point of view. Basically, Arab peoples, citizens, have risen up and expressed a desire for citizenship, for control of their destiny and so on, and that has invariably put them on a course of collision with the United States, because the United States has been the prime enabler of those regimes for its own purposes. So there's been this declaration of independence from the United States that you see, and you can see that even now that the Egyptian military is more responsive and is looking to stabilize things by moving closer to the popular will to some extent. There's a movement, a new independence from U.S. foreign policy, that you sort of see the Egyptians normalizing relations with Iran, for example, ending the Mubarak's role in the Israeli campaign against Hamas, and that sort of thing. On the one hand. On the other hand, you also see the Saudis, for example, expressing the same independence from the U.S. suddenly, realizing that your policies are not actually going to bring us to a position that we want to be in. You're going to put us in a very uncomfortable place. And so with Bahrain, being, I think, a prime example, you see the Saudis too and the kind of counter-revolution elements in the region also moving out of the US orbit to some extent. Neither of them is breaking fundamentally from the US. Neither of them is, turning against the US. Both of them, though, both ends of that equation are expressing an independence. So I think what you've seen is the decline of US influence in the region that had been underway long before the Arab Spring has now been accelerated by it, I think.
Mm-hmm. I also want to ask, what do you think the Muslim Brotherhood will encounter afterwards? I mean, how do you think that this new process will affect Muslim Brotherhood and some other Islamist movements in the region?
Well, I think the Muslim Brotherhood in some ways is a good example because plainly they are the strongest political force in Egypt. To take that as an example, they're also a major political force in the Palestinian equation in the form of Hamas, which would be the Palestinian chapter of the Muslim Brotherhood. I think, Syria might be too early to tell. I think that the new situation actually poses a challenge, even a crisis, for the Muslim Brotherhood, but a potentially very productive one, a very interesting one. When the Muslim Brotherhood is just a banned organization that is in opposition and has no political space, it doesn't have to answer the basic questions of governance. It doesn't have to answer the basic questions as to its program. As a South African who was in the African National Congress in the 1980s, the experience is kind of similar. When you're in opposition, you're a broad church. You're a big tent. It doesn't really matter what your positions are on relations between mosque and state in the future because you're not in power. So you can accommodate a variety of different views. When you move into a situation where governance suddenly becomes the challenge, you're basically throwing open all of the divisions and the questions that need to be asked internally, all the different tendencies. You've seen in Egypt right now, for example, there's this violence that's being stoked by the Salafists against Christians. Now, that's a major crisis for the Muslim Brotherhood. What do they do about this? This does not suit their agenda, and yet some of the people who are agitating in that way on the ground could be deemed to be on the more extreme end of their own support base. In fact, a journalist friend from Cairo said to me yesterday that she was discussing this with a Muslim Brotherhood leader who said that, look, the Salafists are our tea party, as it were. And I think that analogy is sort of interesting, that you have different trends now. I mean, the Muslim Brotherhood was brought into the streets literally by its own youth wing, pressing for it to take a more active role in the uprising than it's all the leadership was actually willing to do. I think that you see a lot of ferment now. A lot of these questions will have to be answered. It's a healthy process. If you take the framework of integration, the idea that basically all political tendencies that count for anything need to be integrated into a process if you're going to have a stable democracy, then this is a profoundly integrating moment. Like Hamas and Fatah in the Palestinian territories, it's the same idea. I think the US made a spectacular mistake in 2006 where it failed to see the integration possibilities of Hamas running for election and instead basically front-loaded a whole lot of conditions onto Hamas, a whole lot of ideological hoops that were set for it to jump through in order to get any aid to the Palestinian Authority, as opposed to actually saying, well, let's actually incentivize good behavior and disincentivize bad behavior, which I think, when census may be what they're finally doing now, 5 years later with the unity agreement of saying, well, never mind what's in the Hamas charter, let's see how Hamas behaves in a sort of Palestinian unity government and try to encourage it in a direction that portends a more democratic politics and a more stable situation and so on. So,
Social media has usurped the traditional media in spreading information and mobilizing communities with regard to political dissent in the region. And second, how can we understand the implications of Arab media using the media reactions to the uprisings in terms of international flow of information and social development? as it resonates around the world?
Well, first of all, what more could I add in terms of context? And excellent to have that kind of discussion going before this. And very few things to add here with specific attention to media. There's a lot of talk about this uprising field. I mean, you just mentioned Facebook revolution. It's been called the revolution will be tweeted, so on and so forth. So, irrespective of where we look, what the topics are, who's discussing, we inevitably come up with media being centered in the discussion, as this uprising, this expression of frustration and revolt has a lot to do with media and the way media works. Before I go into what you asked, let me just begin with a very mundane anecdote, and it's rather embarrassing actually. But when Aydan asked and talked about this panel, the weekend or two before, there was a Tunisia-inspired Facebook revolution or uprising right here at Times Square for Indians or non-resident Indians. And what the uprising was about was a anti-corruption bill that was going to be proposed in the Indian Parliament. A single case of corruption in India had looted something like 4% of the Indian GDP, which is a ridiculous amount, and talks about the kind of corruption that is endemic, that is systemic, and frankly institutionalized not only in India but many, many other countries, including Middle East. There was, when there was a lot of media attention in India about this corruption, the government went through the motions as state politics tends to do, and said, okay, we'll draft a law and to fight corruption in the future. But the people who were going to draft that law were the same corrupt politicians. So members of the civil society said, no, that can't work. Include some people from civil society. It's, journalists, constitutional lawyers, retired judges, and let us be part of this process. And there was a very seemingly spontaneous middle-class civil society expression of complete frustration that India is being robbed of its future, of her global space, and being stained by these corrupt politicians, and we must stop it. And the person leading this was an old Gandhian man, and he just came to Delhi, the capital, along with a few others, groups, and pitched a tent and went on a hunger strike. And said, unless the government allows us to participate in this, we're going to starve, fast on to death. The government refused, and there was a Facebook, Tunisia-inspired Facebook connection and networks and bloggers and tweeters who connected all over the country and all over the world, wherever Indians are, and said, let's show our support for this. So in a strange way, this was happening in the shadow of Middle East. But the style of protest and expression of frustration and people's anger had been mimicked and had been taken aboard. And people here in New York, Indians here, of whom I'm one, said we must show our support too. So what do? Let's go to Times Square. Where else would we get more attention? And show our support there. So there was a Facebook campaign, and I was active online. I shared, I liked, I made my friends do the same. And we went on and planned the whole thing. I wasn't an active planner at all, but I participated in it. And then Sunday came around when we were going to meet at Times Square. And I woke up and I was exhausted with the week. I was really tired because of all the work. It was also the week that India won the Cricket World Cup, so there'd been a lot of late night cricket watching and celebration. And so when it came time to go to Times Square and show my protest, show my commitment, I was exhausted with my life. And I didn't go. So shame on me, right? But Instead of going, I logged on online again. And I checked my friends' updates, and I didn't see any updates. I didn't see any photographs, which was funny. But then I realized that my friends hadn't gone either. People did go. There was a rally. But I didn't go, my friends didn't go. And that says something. You know, that exactly what we talked earlier, that protests, uprising, let alone revolution, requires flesh and blood, requires a sort of commitment that the virtual space and social media and these new media environments are simply not quite adequate to capture. So to keeping this in the background, I want to make 3 points. One is that when we talk about social media being a fuel or an engine behind this uprising, I think that's rather simplistic and inadequate. The second point is, as you mentioned, we need to give more credit to traditional media, and I think in particular the satellite television environment than we are. And less credit to social media and more credit to good old television. And the third point is that in this balancing act of new media versus old media, new media in relation to old media, why do we continue to keep centering media in this social political process? When in a commonsensical ground, we tend to agree that, no, media is important, but media is not all that matters. We need more for uprisings. We need more for protests and revolutions. And yet, no matter what, yet we continue to bring media into the discussion and center media. Why is that? What are the underlying assumptions here? So as as my experience with the Tunisia-inspired Facebook uprising in India via Times Square experience says, it would be simplistic to say that new media and social media is enough, or is the fuel, or is the impulse, or what carries the uprising forward. It requires a different commitment, and as it has already been mentioned. But there's also a flip side to the kind of connections and engines. Even if we agree that social media does play a role, there's a flip side to that as well, and that is the kind of networks that social media lets us build can also facilitate easier surveillance. And it becomes easier to identify who's participating and easier to suppress. And there have been many bloggers, many users, broadly speaking, who have been identified and imprisoned and sometimes killed. So this new media comes with its pros and cons. In any case, the social media environment is marginal, it's fractional in Middle East, we know that. I think there's an estimated 30 million social media users in Middle East out of 500 million in the world. Facebook is 15 million or over, and Twitter is about 5.5 million or over. 40% of Twitter users are in UAE. And we don't really hear of uprisings there. So the people who were marching and braving life and death situations on the streets were fighting for the price of bread, for fighting for jobs and the employment and living conditions. And computers or internet is not a part of their lives. Having said that, there is also a there's also a consensus that no matter what, social media is doing something. It is changing the media information environment. And a lot of that has to do with the kind of attention that social media can get all the way to the Western eyes and the Western ears. That, one has to admit, does mean something. When you can get a local event or a national event to be the trending factor in an environment which has more than 2 million users in tweets, that's power, no denying that. That's some sort of a power, and that gets the attention, gets the world's attention, and that grabs certain kind of credibility that the movement otherwise would not have, the kind of resonance that the movements will not have. And also, in kind of amplifying this movement, there is something else that social media is able to do, and that is accommodate very different constituencies and very different groups within a broader narrative of the uprising and the movement. So Muslim Brotherhood bloggers stood side by side and supported feminist bloggers, supported more secular trade unionists. So you had bloggers with very different political views and different ideologies collaborating in terms of facilitating the network. And also, bloggers could give us stories, give us accounts that more mainstream traditional media were shut out of. So there is definitely a role there. And that does something in facilitating the movement, but it is not enough. That is the common understanding, more reasoned understanding. There are, of course, people like Clay Shirky or others, Andrew Sullivan, who has argued that social media has generated this movement. But a more reasoned, a more middle ground has been that, yes, it does something, but it's not all that there is. I would suggest holding this balancing act, this thought, for a moment, and I'll come back to it in the third point about why we keep lingering and centering media in the discourse here. The second point that I wanted to highlight was the role of television networks. And you've already mentioned the
Al Jazeera?
And others, many others, and not just CNN and not just Al Arabia, but also on TV, Dream TV, many of the national networks, not just the pan-Arab networks. In this dynamic of new media and old media, I think it's critical to understand what exactly did television networks do that opened up the provocative public sphere that you talked about. How did it open up the democratic public sphere? When you have a repressive regime, when you have none of the institutional mechanisms that ensure a democratic public sphere, how is it that suddenly by watching TV we become democratic and we have a provocative, lively, engaged public sphere? How do television networks do that? And I think television as a social, as a domestic network, as a technology, has a lot to do with that. That is how we experience the public sphere, by watching TV. The internet is not part of the majority in the Middle East. However, the television screen is. You don't need to own a personal TV. You don't need a personal subscription to cable and satellite networks. It's there at street corners, it's there at cafes, it's there at the neighbors. You cannot avoid the ubiquitous television screen. And what the television networks did, Al Jazeera starting with, was use the viewers themselves to produce content with the kind of user-generated content of call-in shows, the talk shows, the text messages, and amateur videos, the notion of citizen journalism that they tapped into not for any benevolent or in the spirit of democracy. It's pure business. You need eyeballs. You need your viewer. And to get your viewer, you have to establish viewer identification. How else to do it but to go and talk to you as the viewer, to let you know that you can come on the show, that your voice matters. You as an individual, your life, your struggles matter. It is a great business model, and that is what television networks do. And in that sort of an engagement with the individual viewer and then the individual user, the citizen and the consumer and the viewer all rolled into one, I think we saw the kind of lively democratic public spirit, but also the notion of the self, that the self, I as an individual and my life matters. And that narrative is very important before we can move on to the social media user environment, where you as an individual are tweeting and sharing and liking and disliking. My mother, a professional educated woman, still doesn't understand what's the big deal with Facebook. And she's appalled that why would I want all this attention to myself? And that is a different sensibility, a different narrative of the self. When you are moving on to the user or social media networks, you have to have, before you move on there, a sense of the self and the legitimacy, the validity of the self as a user, as a viewer, as a client, as a consumer. And I think out of this space of privatized television networks and liberal economics, we generated a sense of the citizen and the public sphere that illiberal politics of the state, the repressive state, couldn't allow. But that notion of the self and that notion of the user being very important did something that I think needs to be identified and credited. And that notion of the self is accessible, no matter what gender, what class, what sect, where you come from. That's accessible. You're an individual and I'm an individual. Which is why we could see the Google executive, not even living in Egypt, clearly of a different class, being on television, talking about the nation and the suppression of the self that being a part of that nation involves, resonate with people with very different socioeconomic, cultural, ideological backgrounds. So it creates a space that is accessible, no matter who or where or what you are. And that space is also important in terms of the pan-Arab narrative that was created. And that was created by television networks, so that events in one nation, one area, could be understood as something that is relevant and important across the Arab world. And that construction of the Arab narrative is very important before we can understand the kind of bloggers communities or bloggers networks, the Facebook networks or the social media networks that arose in its aftermath. And also, it's that's not to suggest that the television was all redemptive. Even in the case of Bahrain, for instance, both Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya were remarkably not involved in covering that. So there are political controls there, there are economic controls there, but in the process there has emerged a sense of identity that is both individual as well as pan-Arab.
Can you please explain why Al Jazeera couldn't cover that stories? Maybe our guests not know the reason.
Sure. Al Jazeera, you know, there's a interesting anecdote that when Al Jazeera started off as part of the Qatar, funded by Qatar, it's a political battle between Qatar and Saudi Arabia that led to Al Jazeera and Qatar's decision to be a regional player. And one of the ways that it decided it could be a regional player was to have this sort of media presence. And just as the time Al Jazeera started off in Qatar, blocked down some of the US military presence also moved to Qatar. And both were launched at the same time for the Iraq War. But I think in terms of the Sunni coalition that you were talking about, we know that in Bahrain, the uprising has been classified, or because of the majority Shia population, as a Shia movement versus those who control the state mechanisms and the economy as the Sunni elite. And Qatar's and Saudi Arabia's involvement with Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya reflects, many would argue, that those kind of sectarian divisions and sectarian political and vested economic interests that still control the television networks. So, so there is that political, economic, and very real material limits to which media operates and within which media operates. But the third point that I wanted to make is kind of related, in fact, that why do we keep on centering media? Why do we, even in this balancing act that yes, media matters and yes, social media matters, but not entirely, why do we continue with this sort of almost natural, instinctive need to center media in the discourse? And I would argue that this actually predates the internet and social media. And in a recent book, Morozov talks of digital Orientalism, where the notion is that what you call them our technologies, and if we give them our technologies, if we give them the social media, and we give them the means of media-facilitated expression, then they can come out to the street and overthrow repressive regimes. There is an assumption that media is always redemptive or has a progressive outcome in developing worlds or third world, if I can still use the term. Whereas we still know that the most visited internet sites are pornographic sites or lifestyle sites, how to lose weight, not how to develop democratic societies. So there is still that notion that we need to give media to these people, and they will come out and become democratic and become modern. And this notion is embedded in the kind of media, information, communication infrastructure that was developed and funded and transferred from the West to the non-West. Daniel Lerner, writing in the Middle East, in fact, talked about media as a mobile multiplier that give media to the early adopters, to the elite, and they will come to know of our lives, of how people in distant lands live, of different cultures, and it will create empathy, and it will help them shed away the more sectarian, narrow, traditional boundaries, and move towards a more pluralistic, more open, more democratic societies. In fact, media policy studies, communication policy studies even talk about dosage. What kind of dosage do you need? Because too much media can lead to too many expressions, too many demands, which clearly the state cannot meet. And then what? Disorder, then chaos, and the state crumbles and there's no institutional mechanism to access these lands. So the notion of media as central in social change, central in social policy, comes with this baggage, this historical baggage of Western modernity as progressive and as something that we need to spread around the world and give, and media will play a role here. The only, in conclusion, what I would like to say is that if we can learn anything about media in this uprising, in this movement, it's how it accommodates the contradictions and the competing forces and the competing ideologies and groups, rather than as an umbrella term, as an umbrella that moves towards some kind of progressive outcome. We don't know the outcome, and very often media does not lead to pluralistic, democratic public sphere. But if anything that we can learn from the way media has played out in this social event and phenomena, it is the kind of space it creates to accommodate very different and very competing and divisive or competing ideas that cannot otherwise be accommodated. The way it can include the Salafis and the feminists, the way it can bring the trade unionists and the Muslim Brotherhood, the way it can bring Tunisia and India, and the way it can accommodate and create that sort of a space. That's what needs to be looked further and deeper into to understand.
So, you can just tell us about your vision. What's going to happen afterwards? What kind of Middle East will we face, will we encounter after all these uprisings?
Yeah, it's hard to tell where all this is going to end. One can look at the pivotal conflicts and go, okay, in Egypt.
How should we interpret the language used in the uprisings, and could you please tell us about your own experience and observation in these countries? And what can be next? Also, how do you think Saudi Arabia and Iran will be impacted by these uprisings?
First, thank you for inviting me. And, it's very hard to follow a speaker electronically. I made most of the points that I was going to make, or else I'll, much of what I say may echo what he has to say, but in different ways, obviously. He made some very brilliant and incisive points. About the language, I'm going to say something that's going to sound stupid. The common language is Arabic. What do I mean by that? This is a language shared by many nation states, but is it one nation? Is there an Arab nation? Are these separate Arab nation states? And how do those nation states come about, except by a position of colonial powers, Britain and France? And what I want to talk about in this answer is generally the legacy of colonialism in the region, and how it's fueling very much, I think, these rebellions, and also has a very interesting twist in Libya, where I think there's a traditional suspicion in North Africa, in Africa, and in the Middle East against what appears to be intervention again by the West from NATO in Libya. But I'm going to argue here that it's very different than Iraq. And I don't think President Obama in his speech trying to convince the American people, and he had another audience abroad, that this was a justified intervention, did a very good job of explaining how this is different than Iraq. He barely mentioned Iraq. Now, the language there is a language of courage too. It's a universal language. It's not just Arabic. It's not just an Arab nation. And even in your own lives, you can see when you're up against a very unreasonable authority figure. It could be your boss, could be a parent, could be a spouse, and you can't reason with them any longer. You're either going to have to get out or fight them. And more generally, workers are working 8 hours a day in this country, and they have benefits. They used to have unions. They used to work 8 hours a day. Well, that's another story. because they fought for this and they died. There was bloodshed. You don't get any real social change with it, unfortunately. That's how humans change and progress in history. They're just not going to give in when they've got that kind of power. You go to your boss and you say, I want a raise. And he says, I don't have the money. Then you tell him, well, I'm quitting. Suddenly he finds the money. Did you see the Kuwaiti leader, and then Saudi came up with $1 billion, and then Gaddafi was handing out 4,000? All of a sudden they had this money to hand out to try to buy off people. It was too late, obviously. It was too late. They had pressed their people so much that a few handouts of dollars are not going to buy these people, and that have shown our enormous courage to stand up against these brutal dictators. And these brutal dictators, as Tony pointed out, are there largely because they are remnants of the nation states that were created by Britain and France and then propped up by the U.S. They are either tolerated by the U.S., like in Syria, or actively supported as Mubarak in Egypt. And it was very much about the stability of security for Israel, no question about that, the key. I'm sure the Israelis, even a right-wing leadership, would not mind having stopped saying that we're the only democracy in the region. But if it took dictatorships around there to preserve their security, that was the number one issue for them. When Egypt was going on, I mean, Netanyahu made some, I thought, really ridiculous extremist statements about this is Tehran intercepting. There was no guy in Paris sending cassette tapes back to the streets of Cairo waiting to come in and take over this revolution. It was quite a different situation. And most importantly, these are not extremists. These are ordinary people. I think this surprised a lot of people, except for people who really studied the region. And I'm including government leaders in the West, I think was surprised when it happened, how quickly it happened, and who was taking part. These are not extremists. This marginalized Bin Laden. This showed that Bin Laden and Al-Qaeda and extremists and the Muslim Brotherhood, which is also lumped in by Western media and press as being the same as Al-Qaeda, which is really unfair to both of them. I mean, I don't think Al-Qaeda wanted to be lumped in with the Muslim Brotherhood either. Even if they have 30% of the vote in Egypt, they're not going to be able to form a government if they win, except in a coalition. And I was in Egypt. I got there the day, less than 24 hours after Mubarak stepped down. I was sitting in a hotel room in Amman in a previously planned trip before anybody knew this was going to happen. I was one of the people who didn't know what was going to happen. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that I knew either. And I said, what am I doing in this hotel room in Amman? Let's get on the next plane. And I was in Cairo, and in a half block away in a hotel, Cairo downtown hotel, $26 a night, old Art Nouveau French building, high ceilings, totally in disrepair. The wrought iron lift, filled with trash. But I stepped out on my balcony, and I looked down there, and there was this sea of humanity that I'd been watching with the rest of the world on television for 3 weeks. And it was, I can't explain to you what that thrilling feeling was, to see this and go down into the square and spend a week there. And I think that if anybody tried anything funny, they're going to be back out there. And we saw that that's what happened. I only spent a week there. We saw that the military was trusted by the Egyptian people because they felt they had no choice. This is what a lot of Egyptians do. A lot of people, including myself, were suspicious that they would actually make the kinds of changes and reforms. But I have to say, for the most part, they have put a lot of people in jail, including the steel magnate. They put the former justice minister there. I mean, the security chief. They have made changes at their own pace. But when it looked like they were slowing down, the people were back in the square again, and then they used some force against them. So I think Tony's right that this is more, somebody described it as Mubarakism without Mubarak. But I'm not sure that that's the case. The military will not lose their economic advantages and their autonomy. That's clear. What I think they're going to tolerate, it looks like. I'm not sure that they really liked all of the corruption that they saw outside of their own economic sphere. As I was saying, these are ordinary people, and they will not take it anymore, and they're standing up against these governments that were, or systems that were put in at the end of the Second World War, at the end of the First World War largely. And as you know, this is an unprecedented movement. I interviewed several interesting people, including Elias Khoury, a famous Lebanese novelist, the Secretary General of the OIC, and a man called Georges Corm, who's the Lebanese foreign finance minister. written a great book on the Middle East. It's a bit dated, but it's for that period. It's called Fragmentation in the Middle East. And they all told me that this is completely unprecedented in the history of that region. A region obviously full of enormous turmoil and uprising. You would think, well, why is it different? Why has this never happened? Why is the language of this revolution or rebellion different? Because while you had a 1919 uprising in Egypt that was popular, it didn't spread in the region. And while you had a rebellion in Egypt in '52 led by Nasser that spread across the region, it was not popular. It was a military coup. You had military coups in Syria in '49, but it stayed in Syria. It's the first time you see a popular revolution in the region spreading, and at an enormous speed. The Nasser revolution took 20 years to reach coup to Gaddafi. I mean, it was probably the last of the line of leaders who modeled himself after Nasser. Crazy as he is, Nasser being a more serious figure in history than Gaddafi, and less of a butcher, as we're finding out. We've never seen that. And the other thing we've never seen before is intervention by the West in the region in support of the people. Now, there's going to be a lot of debate with me on this point, and I broke with my friends on the left and a lot of people in the region, because I think it's the first time I could ever remember supporting the American use of power. Maybe Kosovo, I don't really, that's debatable, or Bosnia, but this use of power in Libya, I think, is very different. As I said, I don't think Obama has really explained it, because we had the 1881 rebellion in Egypt by Urabi. He was an Egyptian military man, and Britain came in on the side of the king and put that down. And then the Arab Revolt of 1916 was really instigated by Britain. The famous double cross that people in the region are still angry about, where Sheriff Hussein was in the Hashemite king was promised all this territory, and then, of course, behind his back was made the deal between Sykes and Picot to give Britain and France to carve up what he had thought he was going to get. That's a historic double cross. So when Britain intervened, they instigated this rebellion, and then they double-crossed them. And that left in place these regimes that we're seeing being attacked now. And in addition to that, the later iterations of them supported by the U.S., as I said, like not in Syria, but in Egypt. I'm just going to say a little bit about what I think Obama should have said, why I think Libya is different from Iraq. Then we can carry on. The Libyan rebels asked for intervention. The Iraqi people did not ask for that intervention by the West. Number two, there was a real threat of a humanitarian crisis going on. There was a live humanitarian crisis. Benghazi could very well have been attacked. Thousands could have been killed. There was no live humanitarian crisis going on in March 2003 in Iraq. Saddam certainly had put down brutally rebellions in the south and in the north right after the '91 war, after George Bush Sr. called on people to rise up, and they did nothing to help them. He slaughtered people, the Kurds in the north and Shia in the south. But there was no situation like that going on at that moment. So there was no justification. We're going to intervene to stop the killing, where you could say that in Libya. Number three, there was, again, an uprising already underway in Libya. There was no uprising going on at that time in Iraq. And the uprising by the Libyan rebels was not they're not separatists. They don't want to create their own country. They were trying to change the regime. So regime change was already underway. That was not the case in Iraq. This was done by the United States, unilaterally based with their coalition. Thirdly, there are no ground troops in Libya, and the ground troops that did go to Iraq went immediately to the oil fields, and then when they hit Baghdad, to the oil ministry, and forgot to a museum and let it be looted. Where is the oil motive here? Where is the motives, the same motives we saw in Iraq and Libya? I don't see them. I do think that they should be more open and say we're backing the rebellions in Libya, which I think NATO is doing, but on the sly. And that just feeds the legitimate suspicion of people in the region and on the left that there's something else going on here. That this is just another typical intervention by the West. This is not a responsibility to protect. This is not some fancy humanitarian intervention. That this is just the same old thing. I don't think it is. I think this is the real shift here. Now, why, that leaves the question, why not intervene in Bahrain? Why not intervene in Syria? Why not? You know, this is politics. This is real politics. Yes, you can call it hypocrisy. There is not a universal standard. If you intervene in Syria right now, I mean, the Syrian issue, we have the Alawites, a minority, 10-15% of the country ruling. If they were to fall, there's a real chance for enormous massacre and revenge against them. They're going to fight to the last man. It has a big effect on Turkey, too, where apparently more Alawites living than in Syria. That's another issue that we could talk about. And also the U.S. and Israel tolerated Assad. There's been no fighting between, since the war ended between Israel and Syria. It's a moribund Cold War right now. So Assad's been okay, kind of, for Israel and for the U.S. I think Obama should have explained more clearly about why this intervention in Libya is different than in Iraq, and he didn't. And I think he's left that suspicion around. I think that's a mistake. So just summing up, I think that this is a language of Arab peoples across the region that were once felt they should be a nation, have never been really united because of crazy schemes by Gaddafi who tried to unite all these different times. Even Nasser's ideas never united the people. I think they may hopefully be united, not necessarily as one big nation, but at least in being united amongst the democracies of the world. This is the aim, hopefully. And if the foreign powers that have had a long history they have played correctly, they could